when people ask me in training, like, well, what muscle is that? I'm like, all of them. We aren't built in anatomical systems. I want to do a warrior 2, for example, in the front leg. What muscles are we using? All of them.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I'm extremely excited about our show today. We get to have one of my favorite people in the world coming on the show because she has completely revolutionized the way that I look at the human body. She invited me into a conversation of questions about what we're doing in physical asana that really changed the way I look at the body, and I really thank her for that. Our guest, she's a yoga teacher, a manual therapist, and educator with a master's degree in exercise science and biomechanics. She's also currently writing a book on redefining stretching that's due out in 2017 that I'm extremely excited about. Her name is Jules Mitchell. Welcome, Jules. How you doing?
Hi, that was quite an intro. Thank you. I'm blushing over here.
Well, I really do appreciate you. I mean, not only because of our past relationship and just knowing each other and how you've helped me in the past, but the work that you're doing now, I think, is a really important step for yoga as it evolves in the West, is really kind of demystifying some of the woo-woo-ness of it, and also just getting really clear of like evidence-based ideas on what we're actually doing. So I really appreciate what you're doing in the world. So thank you for all that. For our listeners, maybe you could give us a little bit about your background, how you got interested in yoga, and what got you going down a very scientific approach to eventually getting your master's and everything else, leading you into this realm of physical movement and yoga and therapy, things like that.
I'll do it as quick as I can. It's been, a 20-year process, so a lot has happened in that time. But I discovered yoga in college. And there's a whole awesome story around that we don't have time for today. But I continued through yoga for many years, and then after my mother passed away, it was like the only thing I could do to cope. And so I instantly made yoga my life and became a teacher and all that good stuff. And what ended up happening was I ended up replacing the need to go to yoga to cope and manage grief. I ended up just replacing that sort of, an addiction or obsessiveness with a very intense asana practice. I didn't need it for coping, but then I was like, I couldn't live without asana, and it was a problem. I would sometimes take 3 or 4 classes a day. I would travel. I did everything I could. I took workshops from every single person out there in the world. And then my body started hurting, and I was still relatively young. And so I started asking questions, and then I realized I couldn't get any answers to the types of questions I had in the yoga community. I did get lucky and find a really awesome teacher, Leanne Carey, who taught me a lot about asana. But everything I know about asana, I really credit her for that. But she still didn't have the language or the technical insight. A lot of times the questions that I would have, the answers would come back from her, and she would say, "Don't worry about it." And she was correct. It was fine. It wasn't necessarily, you don't need to know it, but I wanted to know it. And nobody could give me the answers. And so I just had to look outside of yoga. And so that's what I did. I just decided to enroll in a graduate program. And that was also a long path because I ended up getting accepted at UNLV and then moved to California. I had to start the process over. So it was a very long process, but I'm thankful for that, because it gave me time to formulate my question, which I think a lot of times we end up in a grad school program and we get out in 2 years and we still haven't developed the question. And so my question really was what happens in the body when we stretch? We're doing these asana, and is it stretching or is it not is arguable. But regardless, the tissue is being stretched. So what happens? And so that was the path that I went on.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start there, because I know recently you wrote an article on where you defined what you mean by stretching. So we can kind of start at that place. How do you define stretching? Well, and actually, before we even jump into that, we'll acknowledge, as you just did, a conversation of, well, is yoga stretching or this? I mean, we can bypass that whole thing. You said it well, and I think in one of those kind of infographics that you made a while back, where it's like, look, I mean, as a teacher, we can say it's about a lot more than stretching, which is totally wonderful. But that doesn't change the fact that the vast majority of people in the West are coming to yoga because of the stretching benefits, or the benefits of stretching. So there's this
of the
belief, yes.
Right. They are coming because they're seeking flexibility, because
right.
there's a cultural belief that flexibility is good for you, and therefore yoga is good for you, and that's why they're coming.
Yes. So that we at least can accept that that's sort of the standard of why the majority of people are coming. So now that we're doing that, regardless if we're like, well, we think yoga is this, or that, we can acknowledge that this is what the students are coming for. So let's get knowledgeable in this area as well, so that we can both serve our students in that way and whatever way, other ways that we seem fit. So we can start that, but then we can jump into the conversation of, okay, now that we got that out of the way, what is stretching, first of all, to start?
I mean, again, it just depends on who you ask. If you ask someone in the somatic education world, they'll have one answer. If you ask someone in, the athletic world, like, pro sports, you'll get another answer. If you ask someone from yoga, you'll get another answer. And so my take on that is that as long as we're sticking to the definitions that define our own community, we are communicating across lines. And so let's just simplify it all and just really call it a tensile load. And then from there, because that means that you can stretch dynamically when you're just moving around, which, they understand that in sports medicine, that you can stretch statically by holding, that you can stretch while contracting, that you can stretch even perhaps in a restorative posture where you're actually supported within the stretch reflex, but there's still a tensile load in the tissues. And there are still responses, even at a cellular level, when we're not, air quotes, stretching within the stretch reflex. So let's just take all of these personal attachments to the definition away, call it a tensile load, and then from there we can actually look at what are the outcomes that we want to achieve with tensile loading, and then we can manipulate the variables in order to achieve those outcomes. Which I think when we're all fighting about stretching, then we don't actually step back and look at it in that way.
Right. Well, and you went kind of quickly over the terms like dynamic stretching and things like that, but I'd love to clarify that for people too, because I think a lot of kind of people just walking into a yoga class, those are some terms of, let's explain the difference between like a static stretch and a dynamic stretch, because most people associate yoga, even though there's dynamic elements, with more static stretching, I would say. So it's good to get a clear sense of what that is. Could you explain that?
Yeah, sure. There's all kinds of different, methods, and this is again important because they all elicit different responses in the body. So this is just from the ACSM, which is the American College of Sports Medicine. You can go online, and they have a position statement about components of fitness, and you can just kind of check out how they define it. And so they have flexibility training, which interestingly, yoga is not considered flexibility training by the ACSM. It's considered a neuromotor fitness, which is kind of interesting. But under the flexibility training, they have types of stretching. And the first one would be dynamic stretching, which is what we would consider, a warm-up, a one breath, one movement, like sun salutation, even like a fast-paced vinyasa flow, just to kind of warm up the body, moving the joints through full range of motion. That's considered dynamic stretching because on one side of the joint, the tissues are being stretched, like that it is happening. So it's being loaded in a tensile way. And then we have static stretching, which is just holding a stretch, which can be active or passive. Passive stretching would be, for example, Supta Padangustasana, which is, lying on your back with one leg up. If you were holding the toe or using a strap, that would be passive because you're supporting the leg externally. Active would be if you're not using a prop, so just holding your leg up, using your leg muscles. And then they have PNF stretching, which is a combination. There's tons of different styles, but a combination of contracting, relaxing, using eccentrics, resistance stretching. All of that would fall kind of into PNF, again, depending on what you want your results to be. And then the last one would be ballistic stretching, which is kind of the bouncing stretching that we used to do when we were kids in PE before we'd go for a run around the lab, run a lap around the field. And that kind of fell out of fashion in the 90s and was like supposed to be dangerous, but now they realize it's fine. So those would be the main types.
So let's kind of move it. If we've defined, all right, stretching as a tensile load, and we're kind of getting a sense of, okay, well, there's all these different types of stretching. Can we also hear how you define flexibility, and is that different to you than range of motion? If so, what's the difference between those two for you?
This is a big, complex question. Normally, it takes me 8 hours in an online course or in a live course to explain all of this. But I'll just kind of simplify it as quickly as I can. That there's a lot of things involved in range of motion, and it's not always soft tissue stuff. So that means by soft tissue, I mean muscle, ligament, tendon, all that stuff, fascia. That sometimes is, comes into play, but also how the joint functions. Osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, it's early in the morning. Osteoarthritis is a failing joint. So if the joint is failing, it's not functioning, you're not going to have range of motion. You can stretch all day long and nothing's going to change. But also just other components, maybe just misuse of the joint or underuse of the joint, or joint capsule issues. Or so sometimes we think that we can stretch our way into a range of motion, and that's not really always the case. Sometimes it is. So I kind of look at it as a continuum, right? There's how the joint functions, and then there's how the soft tissue yields. And they both need to be working well in order to get the range of motion that you're looking for. Is that?
Yeah, and so, I mean, outside of conditions like osteoarthritis, where a joint is breaking down, would you say it's fair to, because it is big in the yoga community too. I know some like the work of Paul Grilly and guys like that, of the compression versus tension conversation. And, bones are malleable. They do shift over, decades. So, I mean, there is some kind of room there. But would you say you're kind of born with what you got in the bones once you've reached a certain stage of growth? And then...
my concern with that argument is that... sometimes the limiting factor is not the bones, and you can actually, like, a great one is like internal rotation is a really great one. So if you're not skilled, and this is where the manual therapy comes in, right? If you're not skilled at knowing what an end feel feels like, you might say, oh, you don't have any internal rotation. That's your bone structure. But in reality, it's a joint capsule restriction. The arthrokinematics of the joint, so how the joint is working inside, the gliding and the rolling of the joint surfaces aren't functioning properly. And a little bit of training and loading, deliberately can actually improve internal rotation. And when we have improved internal rotation, we can also end up getting improved flexion, which are things that we do a lot of in yoga, a lot of flexion. So yes, I agree that our bone structure limits us, but I also think that then we end up saying, oh, don't worry about it. And so there needs to be a conversation on both sides. Like, when do you know and how do you know? And for yoga teachers, for many of us, that's beyond our scope. What needs to happen is we need to refer out to maybe a manual therapist or somebody, an athletic trainer or something that where that is within their scope. And why is that important? Because somebody might just, be like, oh, that's all my bone structure. It's like, by saying it's just your bone structure, we're actually diagnosing them, and that's out of the yoga teacher's scope. So it's important to understand it may be, but it may not be, and it depends, and it's not really our place to make that judgment sometimes.
Well, and it's one of the sort of unfortunate things I see often in the yoga community right now, where a lot of doctors and people in the medical field are moving towards suggesting yoga and sending people to yoga for various conditions. But a lot of yoga teachers are still very resistant to send people to the appropriate medical fields, where it's like, oh, Western medicine's bad, it's evil, it's overprescribed. And I mean, I personally agree with a lot of the complaints about Western medicine, but at the same point, it's like, oh my gosh, their emergency medicine is amazing, diagnostic medicine is amazing, and regardless of those types of things too, the people that you're referring to ideally have spent a lot more time than a 200-hour or a 500-hour yoga training. They've devoted years or decades to their specific field. So I think as yoga,
a referral system goes both ways.
Yeah.
You should refer up and you should refer down as necessary. And by up or down, I don't even mean that in a hierarchical way. I just mean that in there's a structure of education and background. And yeah, I agree. I think it's very easy for a yoga teacher to say, "Oh, you don't need medicine," and that's not really, again, our place. We should refer out.
Absolutely. Well, and I think as the standards, as the bar gets raised for yoga teachers and education becomes more emphasized, I hope to see eventually us moving out of the Yoga Alliance model of hours and what they do. But I think as teachers get more educated in the language and terminology, or medical terminology, so that they can actually sit down and have a conversation with the doctor or manual therapist. Because that's a big thing that I see. New teachers coming out of teacher trainings, they don't have enough of the language to have a conversation, so that it's just all intimidated, all sounds foreign, so I rather just stay away from it kind of thing.
Yeah, I remember being a teacher and someone being like, "Oh, I have a ACL something or another," and me not knowing what that was or where that was, which is hilarious to me that now I have all this knowledge, and at one point I didn't know that, and I was just looked at the student and was like, "So you know how to modify, right?"
Right. Well, that's like take care of your body, listen to your body. That's like the most common thing when someone hears like, "Okay, listen to your body, you'll be fine." It's like, well, maybe not though. Like, what else can we do here? And
that instruction can sometimes lead us down the wrong path.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of people's listening to their bodies what got them into their problems in the first place, because they were doing what felt normal, but what was normal was based on all their patterns from sitting or doing this or doing that. So it creates a whole other problem. But that's perhaps a different conversation.
Before we change subject, I just want to kind of go on to this, because I just want to make it clear, because I agree with you completely, but I also want to make clear that I don't necessarily think all yoga teachers need such an extensive background.
Totally.
There's plenty of yoga that is like not in that way, but that means that we need to be more clear on recognizing, maybe have different scopes within the yoga teacher community, because like people come to me because they actually have legitimate questions and want to discuss their MRI results, and then I can refer them out and we can work on things because I understand it. But that's not a requirement. I don't want to make that a requirement for yoga teaching, because there's so many awesome, amazing yoga teachers out there that volunteer at the community center once a week that they don't need all this stuff. They're never going to make an income off of it. They're just volunteering, and they are holding space, and they're doing all these other things. So like the practice of yoga in itself is so complicated because it can be so many different things. And so I think that's where our biggest struggle is. It's just, it can't be defined. And I actually just posted on my Facebook page a really interesting article. It's on my desk right now. I was in a Twitter conversation with some people, and they sent me this article. And it was basically this guy trying to define what yoga is for research, because even in the research, there's such a problem. Like, is it the pranayama or is it the asana? And what's this, what type of asana? Is it an Ashtanga practice? Is it hatha yoga? Is it restorative? And so you can't even go to the research and get any conclusions, because the interventions are all so varied. And that's kind of the beauty of yoga, that it is all those things, but it also makes it really hard. So that's what happens. A doctor prescribes yoga to somebody, says, go take yoga. And then let's just say it's a OBGYN, it's a prenatal. And then suddenly this 8-month pregnant woman walks into your vinyasa flow class because her doctor told her to go to yoga. And that's not what the doctor had in mind. Yeah. So now you have to have this whole conversation. Like, you actually probably, this is probably not what your doctor meant. So it's just very confusing for everybody, not just yoga teachers, but students and the medical field. Like, what are we talking about when we say yoga?
Well, and along those same lines, would you say too, then, because there's such a scope of yoga, that not all yoga needs to be therapeutic? A lot of yoga purists, well, yoga can never do any harm and it's always meant to be therapeutic. Do you agree with that? Or do you feel like, hey, there's a therapeutic yoga and there's a dynamic one? I mean, there's all different kinds.
No, not all yoga is therapeutic. And in that sense, you even have to define therapeutic. Like, what do you mean by therapeutic? Because then there's psychosocial outcomes, PT, like, right now I'm involved in research for yoga with PTSD for women who've experienced stillbirth. Like, that's one whole thing. And then there's yoga for osteoarthritis of the knee. And then there's yoga for flexibility. And there's, there's so many different things, yoga for athletes. Like, so is that therapeutic for the athlete? Is it, you hear a lot of language out there is like, I use yoga as my recovery. So do you consider that? Like, so again, if you're going to keep the word therapeutic involved in the medical model, then that changes everything completely. Again, I have a massage therapy license, so I can actually practice under that umbrella, but not everybody can. And so that word just makes everything even more complicated.
And I do want to jump back. You mentioned posting on Facebook. Just for our listeners out there, Jules posts all kinds of amazing stuff on her social media, on Twitter and Facebook, all that, interesting articles, scientific studies when they come out. So we'll give you her information at the end as well, but I encourage you to follow her on social media because she has a lot of really amazing stuff that she's always posting, whether it's her writings or sharing recent findings and stuff. It's another thing I appreciate about.
I definitely share articles when I think they'll be of value to the yoga community.
Yeah. So at this point then, how do you think that all of the study and research that you've done, how has it changed the way that you practice yoga, which you touched on a little bit before, but as well, how has it changed the way that you teach yoga?
It's definitely changed both. I actually have a hard time now kind of defining what yoga is as well. And I'm talking about asana. Again, we're talking about asana. And I definitely have incorporated a lot more like mobility training and strength and resistance stuff, whether it's just like creating internal resistance or partner resistance stretching. I've definitely included that. And then again, a lot of mobility stuff, which means that sometimes our classical, shape of the asana is a little bit different. We might do some interesting variations. But it's all purposeful. So I guess my average class today would look a little bit like a little bit of somatics for kind of proprioception and interoception. I usually start with a somatic warm-up nowadays. And
for people that don't know those words, that's in essence the ability to sense your body in space or kind of the inner workings of your body as well.
Yes. And so they're very like exploratory movements, and they don't follow any rules of any alignment and any of that stuff. They're just kind of like observing gentle movements with repetition and observation. And I usually start with that, and then I will build up into some stronger poses, and then really kind of play with why we're doing poses in a certain way. And I've really, truly, I do not anymore do I cue any of those alignment cues that we've been taught because they don't work for everybody. Mm-hmm. And I can't tell you the last time the words heel to arch alignment came out of my mouth. Maybe 2-3 years ago, 4 years ago, maybe. I don't subscribe to that. I don't even subscribe to, it depends, it's between the arch and the heel, which one. It might be neither. I really look at bodies. And so when I teach a group class, I just leave that stuff out. I say less. I ask more questions. I let people just kind of play around. They know heel to arch alignment. They're already trying to squeeze their bodies into that anyway. So why do I have to reinforce it?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I'll often give starting points of similar stuff like that, but then always encourage hey, if you need to step out wider, step out as wide. You need to angle the back foot forward. But most of the time, because people are so plugged into that pattern, they don't even move. So I'll have to literally come up no, I'm talking to you. Step your foot out wider because that's killing you right there. So it is.
The thing with that is what makes it tough is at what point, this is a philosophical question, but at what point is that your responsibility in a group class? That's the question. So now, when I don't really teach group classes because I'm on the road all the time, but I teach group classes, when I'm teaching a course, we have a class in the morning. Mm-hmm. And so they get to see how I would teach a class if I did teach a group class. And it's I do less. It's not my job in that moment. What is my job is when I'm working one-on-one with someone is to really have conversation, back and forth, ask questions, explore, look at the joint, ask how they feel, look at the quality of the tissue, and make appropriate adjustments for them, so that when they do go to their class, they feel empowered to do the posture in the way that works for them. And so I think it's too much in a group class sometimes. Maybe if you have 3 or 4 people, but you've got 30, 40 people in your class, it's going to be really hard to work with people. And they don't want to feel singled out. They just want to go to breathe and move as well. They want to do it right. So you're correcting them. They don't understand that you're actually helping them do it, again, air quotes, right. But they think it's not right because of all the cues that they've heard before. And it's just not a platform to have that conversation with them.
So there's something, just because we've got you here too, that I'd love to, a couple things I like to ask and get your opinion on too. But and I know you've talked about this in the past. Would you say, well, I'll put it just directly, do we need to relax to stretch? Because that is one of, you come in your class, relax your muscles. Like it's thrown in. We're talking about some things that yoga teachers say. That's one that's in there all the time. But is it actually accurate? Do we need to relax to increase our flexibility or range of motion?
Well, again, I think this goes to how are you defining all your terms and what is your outcome? There is some benefit to relaxing because the central nervous system will hopefully override the stretch reflex. And so there is some benefit to that, but it's actually there's other ways. You don't have to do it that way. Sometimes just getting a muscle strong will get it more flexible. So, if we're talking about trying to work with the muscle spindles, which kind of manage the stretch reflex, and we're dealing with gamma motor tone. So it's a complex thing. I don't want to get too into it, but the gamma motor neurons basically innervate the alpha motor neurons, which are the ones that contract the muscle against a stretch, right?
Well, and so when you're talking about the stretch reflex, you mean when we go into a stretch, the nervous system responds by actually tightening to protect injury, correct? So yeah.
Spindle, yeah, exactly. The muscle spindle gets activated, and then when the gamma motor neuron tone is set too high, then it tells the alpha motor neuron to contract the muscle. So yeah, there is going to be maybe a little bit of benefit to trying to get the central nervous system to override that response. So that's I think what let go is coming from. But there's plenty of evidence to show that isometric contractions can also help reset that tone. So it's not like it's the only way. And the only reason that I prefer, for me personally, the kind of contract approach is because I think in general, yoga teachers and students, and especially students and teachers who really only practice yoga, because that's what we do. We love it so much, we don't do anything else, that they could really benefit from some strengthening stuff. And so that's kind of why I've started to incorporate that. Is it better all around? Is it right? No, none of that stuff. But overall, I think that we just don't spend enough time strengthening. And if you know anything about biomechanics, it never hurts to get stronger. And so I incorporate that now.
Well, and that was something that you had asked in a workshop that I took of yours a few years ago, where you're like, do you ever want to be able to go to a range that you're not stable in anyways? Which, a lot of the static, just kind of sit on the floor and bend over kind of stretches. It's like, okay, that's nice. But if you're just relaxing everything and you're not building any stability, what purpose is that? You've mentioned people will have different goals for things, so there might be some specific cases for that. But as a general rule, we don't need ranges that we can't be stable in. That's actually upping our potential for injury. So the strength element is a really big thing of how can we create stability through these different ranges of motions, because I
don't even want to use the word stability, because I don't think people understand that word, but in reality, what is stability? Stability, in my opinion, is the ability to have mobility, but be able to control it.
Strong, yeah.
So stability and mobility to me are the same word, because otherwise you're just, if you have mobility and you can't use it, then it's not really, in my mind, mobility either. They're almost the same thing. So to replace, both of those words with control, are you able to go to this range of motion and then use it in any way you want? And I'll just give a simple yoga example. I did this in the class that I taught just this weekend. I was in Portland. Everyone's on their back in the beginning class, and we lift a leg up. So it's like Supta Padangusthasana, right? One leg is in there, but it's active. So they're not holding on. There's no strap. They're holding the leg up using their muscles. And they're going to their end range. And then I asked them just to draw like tiny little, like imagine they had a pencil on the end of their toe and they're trying to draw a circle on the ceiling or the wall, whatever their flexibility allows them to go to. And, you know, in the room of 36 students, there's very few circles. There's a lot of ovals, a lot of triangles, a lot of oblong shapes, because at that range, there's very little actual control. And I'm not saying that actually has to be that way, but I use it as an example. Like, so you want to go to this end range of flexibility, and now how specific can you actually be there? Like how much does your nervous system communicate with the receptors in the joint so you know where the leg is in space and how to make small adjustments? And so that to me is what's most important.
And it's true as well that when you're towards your max ranges of mobility and flexibility, your muscles aren't as maybe I'm not using I want to make sure because we're so technical with words, but like they're not as strong, or they're just not as like you don't get as much of the communication with the neurons at that point, but you
can if it's trained. That's the thing, is most people don't train it. Like how often do you actually do things at your end range? So I think it's not that it's biologically set up that way. I think it's just that we don't use our end range, and therefore we end up losing our end range because we don't use it. And so then if we just passively push into it by doing things like relaxing and whatever, we can get that end range back, but we've never used it for anything. So now we have it and can't use it, and I'd rather have it and use it.
Gotcha. Another question is that, I would definitely say that there is a mindset, and this is a generalization, of course, because not everybody feels this way, but a general mindset within the yoga community that more flexibility equals better. Would you say that there's evidence to actually support that, or what's your view? Is more flexibility better?
That's no. But also, like, if you really want to analyze that, it would be like, well, flexibility of what? Like, of where? We're talking about the shoulder, like whatever, you know. So, and what is your task? Like, you know, if you're a soccer player and you kick a ball, so you go rapidly into hip flexion and knee extension, you should probably have some pretty adapted hamstrings for that, you know. So then, yeah, in that sense, yes. But to just like live a normal life, not necessarily. And you know, there's, you know, especially if you take on the somatic education world, they don't even really care at all. They just want to make sure that you can achieve it somehow, the task somehow, and that there's a million different ways you can do something, and that your body can figure it out. So no, I just don't subscribe to that, and I don't like to sentence people who don't have flexibility. But again, if it is because a lot of times, like the hamstrings are a big one. That's like the one you see the most. A lot of times, again, it's just because the gamma motor tone is just set too high. And most people come to me like, oh, my hamstrings aren't flexible. And my first in my mind is like, let's just get them a little stronger and you'll have the flexibility that you need. Like, I don't necessarily say that because they don't want to hear it. They're not ready for that. But I know that it's like a little bit of strength training, and usually you'll get the range that you need.
Yeah. Well, and there's a big conversation there as well, where I think, you know, one of the most common things as a yoga teacher here is, oh, I have tight hamstrings or I have tight hips. And in particular with the case of the hamstrings, and again, this is not across the board, but an overgeneralization, a majority of people that I find in my classes need to strengthen their hamstrings more than they do to stretch them anyways, because their hip flexors, their quads are so tight, they're just yanking on the other ends of these that, you know, it's the result of sitting and other things in our culture, that most people benefit from strengthening the hamstrings because they stretch them because they think they're tight. And that's why we have so much yoga butt, AKA hamstring tears, because people are just yanking on the hamstrings all the time. Yeah.
And I'll go even further and say they also need to strengthen their hip flexors.
Mm-hmm.
I see it all the time. People think that because you sit that you get strong and tight. Strong and tight aren't the same thing.
Yeah, I can see
you can be, I mean, they're not, it's not flexible and long and strong and tight. It doesn't work like that. We're not built like that. And so I think everyone just needs stronger muscles around the hip, all of them. It's not like, and on that note, it's like if you actually contract your quads and your hamstrings, you'll also contract other muscles in the hip. Like we don't operate like that, because I think you're kind of wanting to go to a certain question. So I'm kind of helping you lead into it. But it's like when people ask me in training, like, well, what muscle is that? I'm like, all of them. Like we aren't built in anatomical system. Like if I want to do a I don't know, like just warrior 2, for example, in the front leg, what muscles are we using? All of them.
Which is a big challenge in the kind of mechanistic model that we get of Western thinking, where we took the body apart, which can be very helpful, because it's important to know, like, where are these muscles that we're calling the hamstrings, and where are the quadricep muscles. That's great, and I see the value in separating it. But as you're saying, there's a big movement right now moving back towards a more holistic model, because that's the way the body works. I mean, the body doesn't think hamstrings and quadriceps. It thinks, I've got motor neurons and they're separated all throughout the body, and how do I achieve this action?
The body knows how to achieve a task, not where the muscle is. So, you can tell someone to engage their hamstrings, and the only reason that they know how to do that is because they've studied anatomy to know where their hamstrings are, because the brain inherently doesn't know. And then you'll get different responses across different people based on their interpretation of where, so it's really, I do think there's value in dissecting and taking apart, of course. But then the missing component is, let's put it back together.
So I want to kind of wrap up our chat here a bit, but if we could say that, or if you could say that you had one thing that you could tell kind of the yoga community as a whole, of just a suggestion of a way to approach practice. I mean, again, generalizations can be dangerous things, but if you could kind of impart a piece of advice to the yoga community, what is it that you would encourage them to do more of or less of, or what's your feeling?
So for teachers, I'm going to gear this toward teachers, since that's really what I do, is teach teachers. I would say question everything and say less. That's always, like, every time I leave a course, I'm like, don't panic, because they learn so much stuff. And I'm like, don't panic. Just don't, you don't have to say as much. If you don't actually know exactly what that means, don't say it. A great example is, once we're in downward dog, like we always start cueing, all these things to do with the shoulders, and they're already there. And if you don't quite understand anyway the workings of the shoulder joint, telling, like in yoga, this is what I always do. So I put them in the pose and then tell them all the things they should do. But really, it all already happened. It already happened on the way there. So I just like say a little less, give a little more space for people to explore, and then if you want to study biomechanics, and study biomechanics. It's not required, but if you do, it'll give you a little more insight, I think. But otherwise, like, I think we sometimes feel compelled to impart all this anatomy wisdom on our students, and I think sometimes it takes us down the wrong path.
Awesome, that's excellent. I agree as well. I think in that context, the more you learn around anatomy and biomechanics, the more you kind of want to share it. But we have to realize that there's backdoor and front door conversations where you walk into a yoga class and you start spewing about, like, reciprocal inhibition or this and that and all these different words and scientific this and gamma that. People were like, what? I have nothing. Even on the cues, you're like, now internally rotate this and extend it. People are like, what the hell are you talking about? So it can be lost in translation versus, like, just hug your legs together and just see where that goes for people, or things like that, and help with the actions as opposed to anatomical words. So that's great. Well, you are such a wealth of information and knowledge. You've got online courses. I know you do some work for, I forgot the name, I didn't write down right here, but for an online yoga site as well.
Yeah, I do a course for Metaversity. That's on my website.
So you do all kinds of stuff. Where's the best place for people to find out information about you? Do you have any upcoming courses or anything?
My website is probably the best. My website is julesmitchell.com, JulesMitchell. There's 2 L's. And on there, you can buy the online course. It's downloadable. I think it's like 4 or 5 hours, and then it's a slideshow, a lot of theory. And then on my workshops tab, I'm all over the place. So I'm going East Coast for the next 5 weekends in a row. So I just check there, and anytime I book something new, it gets posted pretty quickly. So I guess that would be it. My website, and then social media, of course.
Yes, which you're very active on.
Yeah, I'm kind of active. I don't spend a lot of time on social media, but I do post a lot of really cool stuff. Yeah. And then sometimes I don't get back to it because I'm busy writing and teaching. But I am active on Twitter, so that's a really easy way to communicate with me.
And that's also just at Jules Mitchell, correct?
My Twitter handle's Jules Yoga, at Jules Yoga.
Jules Yoga. Perfect. And I'll include that in the show notes as well.
Okay, awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jules, for being on the show and imparting your knowledge. Thank you so much for the work that you do in the yoga community. I'm inspired about where I see yoga going, where we have more people like yourself getting involved with the community and sharing a more rigorous, evidence-based approach to what it is that we're doing. And I really appreciate that, because I want to see, especially in this country, but globally, that bar getting raised, and you're doing a great part of doing that. So thank you so much for that. And for all our listeners, I'm sure the yoga teachers have loved this episode. Hopefully all the yogis and other people have gotten stuff out of it as well. But definitely go check out Jules and the works that she does, because she's incredible. Thank you all so much for listening today. I hope you have a very wonderfully present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.